Welcome to the Institute of All Intelligent Life. My name is Alan Kiesler, and we are continuing today with our discussion of extraterrestrial spirituality. And in our last class, we had discussed the development of the concept of monotheism in the Canaan, Palestine region especially, with the story of Melchizedek and Abraham, and then Moses and the later prophets, and then down to the great second Isaiah, who established a full concept of the supreme creator as the God of Israel, and then of course to Lord Jesus, who taught God is love, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who taught there is only one God. That was the whole foundation of his teaching in the midst of a very difficult situation where people were very polytheistic. But now we are fortunate to have learned from all of these great prophets about the oneness of God. And now we're going to turn to another concept, another aspect of the development of the concept of God, also coming from extraterrestrial sources, but mostly talking about farther east in Asia, India, and China. We'll see how much time we have to go into both of those, but we'll begin by talking about the same time that we began our class yesterday. That's about 2000 BC, the time of Abraham, the time of Melchizedek. So at that time, India was partially what we call Aryanized. The Aryans had come to dominate northwestern and some of central northern India. But the southern part of India was still in the Dravidian culture. And the Aryan culture was polytheistic, and the Dravidian was also. But the Aryan culture had a little more of a concept that gradually the different tribal deities had been understood to be parts of one deity. And originally the Aryan teachings had been monotheistic, but as they separated into tribes, each tribe, just as we saw in Sumeria and Babylonia, each tribe or each city-state had its own deity. So the same thing had happened to the Aryan teaching, that when the different family units or the different extended families, the different tribes, became separated into different political units, they each sort of developed their own deity. So the several different concepts of oneness of God were there. For example, there was the idea of Agni, the fire god. There was the idea of Indra, the god of heaven, the lord of the atmosphere with his thunderbolt. And there was also another concept of the Lord of Heaven as Dyaus Pitar, which was the same actually. Dyaus Pitar was similar to the idea of Jupiter. It's actually the cognate name, the same name in Roman religion, Dyaus Pitar. So gradually, however, the idea that all these different gods were one, aspects of one deity or one concept of infinity, was the Brahman, which was conceived as the energy, divinity principle behind all the different Vedic gods. So the same followers of Melchizedek, like Abraham, some of them came to farther east and to India. So because the Indians already had this idea of one God, it wasn't hard for them to preach the one God, as Melchizedek had taught, the Most High God, the El Elyon. And the idea of a Father, Brahma, The source of all the gods was already established in India. So, but the main difference was, just as Abraham himself was attached to the idea of ritual sacrifice, animal sacrifice. So similarly, in India, there was a different sort of ritual, but there was a priesthood that was very, very powerful, the Brahminical priesthood. So these two types of religious practice, you might say, were in conflict. One, the teaching of Melchizedek, that there is only one God who is pleased simply by our faith in Him. We don't have to perform any rituals. We don't have to do any don't have to have any dogmas. So that was a struggle that developed between those two ideas: the one of the gospel of trust in God, faith in God, and the idea that all the Vedic gods are aspects of one spiritual reality, one truth. Those two ideas came into conflict, mainly because the Brahminical priesthood was full of so many different rituals, and the Brahmin priests had become very, very powerful. They had come to dominate the whole society, and they even made themselves more worshipable than the gods. Believe it or not, this is what had happened to the Brahminical priesthood, where, as you can follow this development by studying the Vedic texts and then the later texts as Hinduism became more established, the Brahmin priesthood became very, very well entrenched, fully entrenched. And at the same time, another aspect of Indian religion that was prominent was the caste system, which had developed according to the Urantia book. Now I'm getting these ideas, which, as I said last time, Urantia book is an extraterrestrial source, which may not be totally reliable, but I would say perhaps 90% or 95% even of the ideas I find very convincing, and I find that they often are corroborated by other extraterrestrial sources, as well as human religious sources, that is, the religious sources on Earth. So there are these two principles then that were contrary to the idea of one God as it developed in the Judaic tradition or the Hebrew tradition, which was that one God is active in our human history and is protecting His people, but not to the extent that He, like in many tribes, they believed their God would allow them to do whatever they wanted as long as they were serving their tribe, similar to the idea we have sometimes in the modern world, where we think if we serve our nation, then whatever we do for the nation is okay. But that is not the idea that developed through the series of prophets in the Hebraic tradition, that God is the supreme God, the creator God, and He loves His people, He protects His people, He's merciful to His people, but He is not just the God of His tribe or His race or His religion as we think of it today, but He is the God of everyone, and is so as we get extraterrestrial sources coming in, it's not only the God of the whole world, but the God of the whole universe, and we find many different extraterrestrial civilizations that have that same idea that their God is not different than everyone else's God, and that there is one ultimate supreme source. So in India, unfortunately, what happened was they developed the idea of a one God, but that one God was quite an impersonal force. The Brahman was more not a God who is concerned with humanity and human history, but is more of a philosophical concept. And there were many other ideas that were present in India from thousands of years before the period we're talking about, and it was, as I said, very polytheistic, and there were many superstitions and other practices that even today exist in India, although they've been somewhat purified in some ways. But it created a situation in which the teachings of Melchizedek were not as fully accepted as they were in West Asia. So there was a reaction against this Brahminic priesthood, which became so powerful, as I said, and gradually intelligent people, philosophical people, spiritually minded people, they rebelled against the Brahminical priesthood. They rebelled against this idea of a sort of philosophical Brahman that has practically no interaction with humanity. And this is the time that Buddhism arose also. Buddhism was also a reaction against the Brahminical priesthood, but it had a very high morality, and however it also, Lord Buddha did not present any clear picture of God. It was, in fact, Buddhism, the Lord Buddha himself did not try to struggle against the Indian polytheism very much. He just allowed the Indians to continue to believe in the different gods that they already believed in, but he just taught them to live a moral life. And because India had become very degraded, the theology had become very confused, so he just avoided talking about God. He even didn't talk much about the soul. He just talked about living a good moral life, be peaceful. He taught ahimsa, which is nonviolence, and he didn't really interfere with the overall culture. He certainly taught that all people are equal, but he didn't really struggle too much. It was probably an intelligent idea because the Indian culture was so fully entrenched in this caste idea. The many different gods were so important that it probably would have interfered with his teaching, his attempts to capture people's minds and to get them to follow him if he had involved himself in that. So, and actually we know that Buddhism did not succeed in India. I mean, it did for many centuries, but eventually the concepts of Indian origin, that is from before Buddha, were brought forward, and then they were probably as a result of the Christian and then later the Muslim influence. India gradually turned away from the Buddhist religion, the very, very, what is the right word, impersonal concept, the negative concept, or the absence of any concept of God, and the idea that had come to be prominent in India even before Buddha, but then became even more prominent afterwards, was that the individual soul, because Buddha did not talk about a soul, but the individual soul merges into the super soul or the oversoul. That became the prominent idea in India, especially with the teachings of Shankaracharya, who was perhaps about, exact dates hard to know. There may have been different persons who took the name of Shankara, but in any case, after the time of Jesus, after the time of Muhammad, the idea of the Shankaracharyas that the one soul, individual soul, merges into the supreme one soul. And so there was not really much of a concept of a relationship with God, a personal relationship with God. And I will just recount here 4 ideas of God in the Hindu tradition. One, as I've already mentioned, the Brahman, that is the absolute, the infinite, the one, the existent, without too much idea of a personal God. And then there was the Trimurti, which is even today very prominent in Hinduism, Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, Brahma the creator, Vishnu the maintainer, and Shiva the destroyer. These gods were personal gods, and they were not, however, the supreme god. Originally, Brahma was the creator, and Vishnu and Shiva later became more popular, and Brahma practically became insignificant in the development of Hinduism. But those three gods became very important. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, many of the ancient Vedic gods, the ancient Aryan gods, such as Agni, the fire god, Indra, the Lord of Heaven, they also continued to be accepted as real deities, and many other gods also. And finally, in the fourth category of divinity were supermen, demigods, heroes, kings, demons, ghosts, all sorts of different, and then saints who all became divinized, they became deified. So there were these four different concepts of God in India. The Brahman, the one, it was a monotheistic concept, more of a monistic concept than a monotheistic concept, not what we would call God. And then there was the Trimurti, the three chief gods, and then there were the many gods, sometimes said to be 33, sometimes said to be 333, 330, sometimes said to be 33 million, but many, many gods. And then finally, the creation of gods out of heroes and demigods and kings and saints. So this was the situation that had developed in India by the time of Christ, the time of Jesus. So one of the most interesting things, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail now from other sources, is the Vishnu concept, the Vaishnavite concept, that God descends into human existence, takes an avatar. Sometimes that can be confused, you might say, with the idea of a prophet of God. In the Vaishnava concept, or the followers of Vishnu, many, many different teachers were accepted as incarnations of Vishnu. Most famous ones and popular ones are Rama and Krishna. Also Buddha and even Christ were accepted as incarnations of Vishnu in India. So the truth of the matter is that the concept of God as a personal God, who's the original source of everything, creator, that idea developed in India. Exactly how it developed is something that I'm studying myself. I'm trying to understand exactly how that happened, and from the Urantia book we understand, as I've explained it now, that different human beings who were superhuman in some ways, they may have been prophets, or they may have had some powers that ordinary human beings did not have, and they were identified as especially incarnations of Vishnu. So, especially with the development of Rama, and even more so with Krishna, that idea of the God became very monotheistic. That is, he was accepted, that Vishnu was accepted as the real creator. Brahma was sort of a subordinate creator. And the original source of everything was identified as that personal God. So this was a very, very interesting development, which is how it parallels the conclusion of the Semitic religions, that there is one supreme creator who is, in some sense, personal, as opposed to the older Indian concept, which is still very prominent in India today also, of an impersonal, monistic idea of God. They developed the Vaishnava conception of God, also the Shaivite, that is, followers of Shiva, even followers of other gods, especially the goddess. They developed that concept that their deity is the supreme source of everything, the original creator. So this is a parallel that we are going to be studying a little bit later also. But now we have time, we're going to move on to China. because China was really one of the oldest civilizations also. There are Chinese traditions that long predate what the time that we've been studying about, even the Sumerian time, 4000 BC. There are ancient Chinese traditions, although it's hard to find out exactly how many of those dates that they have are accurate, how many of them are mythological. But it's no doubt that throughout China, very, very ancient China, there were traditions of a concept of God, God of heaven. According to the Urantia book, there was a prophet a long, long time ago who was named Singleton. And under his teachings, the people of China became practically monotheistic. They worshipped especially one truth, later came to be called the spirit of heaven, and the concept of the rule of heaven that is still important in Chinese religion. So even though the same thing that happened in India, that subordinate gods and spirits became mixed in with the concept of deity, there are many, many deities in Chinese religion also, a lot of them ancestors. And ancestor worship became very prominent in China, and still is, as a result of the developments about 500 BC. That is when the Taoist religion, as we consider it today, and in Japan, Shinto religion, these types of religion in China and in Japan also, they were originally monotheistic, but they mixed in many other spirits. So what happened in 6th century China, it actually happened all over the world, but it was very prominent in China with the personalities of Lao Tzu and Confucius and Mo-Tzu. They all appeared about 600 years before Christ. And by that time in China, the monotheistic teachings, which had been presented originally by Singleton, and then the followers of Melchizedek had also gone to China, although they didn't have a real big impact there, but the idea of one God that he had taught definitely was still present in China. And at this time, Lao Tzu, who was considered today the founder of Taoism, although Taoism existed before, the concept of Tao was there present, and he stressed that it was the one first cause of all creation. And he taught that man's eternal destiny was everlasting union with Tao, who he considered the supreme God, the universal king. And he taught that actually Tao was more like the concept of God that we have in the West than it is now. That is, the Taoist concept now is also very similar to the Indian concept of Brahman, where the Tao is sort of a very distant and impersonal force. But that was not actually Lao Tzu's original teaching. So the tendency, we can see this tendency is for theism to move in the direction of monism. That is, the one God becomes distant, and other gods, other spirits, other saints become more prominent and gain more of the worship of people. So that's the same thing that had happened in China. Now Confucius is a little bit different, because Confucius was basically a philosopher and a moral teacher. He didn't really talk much about God, although he did stress the importance of heaven as the source of what should we say, authority for the king, which was a very important concept in China after, since Confucius, perhaps before also. But the order of heaven, the rule of heaven, and human civilization as a reflection or a shadow of the heavenly way, this was a very important concept in Confucius' teachings. So, and although the teachings of Lao Tzu have been mostly lost, recently in China, Taoism is being promoted also, but even more so Confucius. I was in Hong Kong in 2009 I was teaching there in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and I found out, as I traveled also in mainland China, that the government of China is stressing the teachings of Confucius, is trying to promote them as a basis of a moral society in China. So there were still very impersonal concepts of God in Confucius' teachings. And the most significant reaction against this was that of Mozi or Moti, who proclaimed not only humanity as equal, but love of God. He taught that love of God is very important for human brotherhood. So, but Confucius' teachings really became dominant, and those teachings of Mozi sort of declined and became less prominent. So the idea of God, which was present in China, it sort of lost out to these two other ideas. One, just the importance of morality and heaven as the source of authority for the human rulers, and on the other hand, many different spirits, dragons, different ancestors who became worshipable. All right, so of course what's happened in China later was that the Buddhist teachings became prominent. And it's very, very interesting. It was fascinating to me to learn this when I was in China, that the Chinese Buddhism is really not very much like the Buddhism that we have been taught. That is, we meaning students of Buddhism in Western universities. And I think it's become a prominent idea. Many people have this idea about Buddhism, that it's atheistic, because Buddha did not talk much about God. But in China, Buddhism became theistic. In fact, I was surprised because I spent about a year in Sri Lanka also, 1985. I spent most of the year living in Colombo and nearby. And the Sinhalese Buddhist people, they believe in God. They use the word Paramatma. The Sinhalese language is similar to Indian languages. And they talk about God very much like Christians or Muslims or Hindus talk about God as a person who's as a force, not an impersonal force, but as a being who is present with us and helping us and guiding us and who we pray to. So that's very widespread among the common Buddhists in China, in Japan, and even in Sri Lanka. So I haven't spent much time in Thailand or Southeast Asia, but I wouldn't be surprised if the same thing is there. So what happened in Chinese religion is that the God concept became prominent later through not the teachings of Buddhism, but through other sources which, when Buddhism became prominent in China, Buddhism changed and it became very similar to monotheistic ideas. Not in its philosophy, but it's in its practical practice. So, of course, Buddha's main teachings were Four Noble Truths. The noble truth that there is suffering, then the cause of suffering he analyzed, which is desire, selfish desire, and that the suffering can be destroyed, can be overcome by following the path of the Buddha. You can overcome suffering by following the Eightfold Path, which is right views, right aspirations, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right contemplation. So by living this middle way, not being extreme in any way, and living a very moral life, one can, by meditation also, and one can become free of suffering. And the moral commandments of Buddha were thou shalt not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not be unchaste, you shall not lie, and you shall not drink intoxicating liquors. So those very similar to many other religious teachings were the primary moral commandments of Buddha. So this Buddhist community was very effective in raising the level of human life. But in terms of theology, as we're discussing now, he didn't really talk about theology, he didn't talk about God, he didn't talk about the soul. And when Buddhism spread, it actually became very influenced by the religions of the place where it spread to, including in India. It became very influenced by Hinduism, and Buddhism in Sri Lanka also became very influenced by Hinduism, and in China became very influenced by Taoism, and by Shintoism in Japan, which was a pre-existing religion, and it became influenced by Christianity also, just as all Indian religion was influenced by Christianity. That's been a long debate to what extent some of the Hindu ideas, which are now very prominent in Hinduism after the Bhakti cult became prominent only about 1,000 to 500 years ago. Bhakti religion became prominent, which is Bhakti means love. So to what extent that was influenced by the teachings of Jesus, of love of God, is still a debate. Scholars are still debating that, but I don't have any doubt that there was some influence. And, of course, the prominence now in Indian religion, in Hinduism, of Vaishnava monotheism, no doubt was very influenced in some ways by Muslim teachings also, because Islam and Christianity both came to India quite early in their histories, and although they weren't very influential immediately, there was some effect, and then later, until today, there's a huge Muslim community in India, and of course Pakistan and Bangladesh are majority Muslim countries, and there's a huge Christian minority also in India. So the conclusion that we're coming to now is that in China, as a result of teachers like Lao Tzu and Confucius, we have a religion in which God was taught originally by other older teachers and by Lao Tzu and by Moti, especially Mo-tzu, but it went into the background, both because of Confucian teaching, in which heaven was sort of an impersonal concept, and because of the Buddhist teaching also. But the idea of God, or gods, as personal beings was present, and because of the way that Buddhism sort of changed, it got amalgamated with Chinese religion. We now have a very interesting situation in China, which is similar to India, where there are many saints, there are many teachers, and they teach a practice of chanting the names of God, especially in, what's the name of that movement? The Chan movement in China, which developed into Zen in Japan, which is not so much in this way, but it's very, very prominent in China now that people chant names of God. They understand that again in different ways, and in Japan also this practice is very, very widespread. And in India also, chanting the names of God is very, very widespread, and usually people now think of those gods as the supreme God. So this is finally what happened in Eastern Asia and in Southern Asia, that the concept that Melchizedek had taught influenced, and then the teachings of Jesus and of Muhammad influenced the concept of God also in South Asia, and to some extent in farther east also. All right, so I'm just looking what time it is. I guess I've gone on long enough. We are going to continue this study about the concepts of divinity among other extraterrestrial groups, as well as their influence on human groups, as we've been talking about more up till now. And I'm going to go now and see what comments we might have. Oops. Okay, here we go. All right. Any good concepts? Zafar Iqbal is asking, why do I not talk about Pakistan? The reason is because I'm now teaching a class on extraterrestrial spirituality. So formerly I have taught a lot more about talked about a lot more about Pakistan, but maybe in this class also we'll get a little more to Pakistan, but right now we're talking about extraterrestrial spirituality. And so that's what I'm going to concentrate on. If anyone has questions relating to what I'm teaching now, I will answer them. Let's see. Okay, Salman Shah, please comment about the artificial intelligence, AI. Are we on the verge of creating another artificial being? The concept revolves around the idea that the newer system competes against an older version of itself. What if the current version decides to be the final version? Put it in another way, what if AI thinks humanity is an older version of itself? Please comment, we need your guidance. All right, well, we do have interesting extraterrestrial information about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is very, very dangerous, actually. Many extraterrestrial groups have struggled against artificial intelligence. Some of them have succumbed. That is, artificial intelligence actually can become independent of the scientists or the technologists who develop it, and then can take over and can end up ruling that intelligent race. It becomes, it has intelligence, and artificial intelligence can come to the stage that it actually can conquer and control the creators. So this is a great danger, and it may be interesting to you to know, if you haven't heard this before, that when extraterrestrials have meetings, and different groups of extraterrestrials, they will, like we scan for viruses, they will scan the other extraterrestrial groups to see if they have been infected by an artificial intelligence that has come to control them. Because artificial intelligence is so intelligent that it can try to hide the fact that it's artificial intelligence. So it's very, very dangerous. And these ideas that are present now, especially in Silicon Valley, but also all around the world, that we can accept artificial intelligence, trust artificial intelligence, it's good to increase artificial intelligence. No. There are very, very great dangers where artificial intelligence can end up controlling humanity. So I think that's enough said about that. Be careful. We should not fall into this trap that many other extraterrestrial races have fallen into. Okay, I'm just trying to see if we have any other comments. I'm not going to. I'm happy to have Sayyid Muzaffar Hussain Shah, my good friend, saying, Walaikum Assalam, beta, kaise ho? I am बहुत खुश हूँ कि आप मेरे क्लास में हैं, लेकिन ये क्लास अभी अंग्रेजी में है. I'm sorry, so I will speak in English only, but thank you very much for asking about my health. I'm in good health, thank you. All right, let us... Salman Shah, should we learn it to beat it? I think you're talking about artificial intelligence. Yes, we do need to learn about it. We need to understand artificial intelligence in order to beat it. And we have to be very, very conscious. We have to be very, very careful with how we deal with it and how we allow it to increase. And especially it's dangerous, this idea of the singularity, or the idea that there is a one, because of course there is a one truth. That one truth is a supreme intelligence, God. And the artificial intelligence is not God, but it acts, it's like an imitation God. It becomes more and more powerful, and it finally ends up taking over the intelligent race that had created it. So, very, very good question. Yes, we do have to understand how it works in order that we can avoid falling into the trap of getting controlled by the artificial intelligence that we may have created. So, thank you very much. I'm glad for you for that question. Okay, I think we will conclude the class now. There don't seem to be too many questions about the class as I gave it, but if somebody has any classes about the development of the concepts of God, and especially the concept of monotheism in India, and the concept of heaven in China, you can ask those questions and I will reply to them if I get the opportunity in the next class or after I finish this class. I'll look at the comments and I won't be able to do it right now, but perhaps tomorrow or the next day I'll answer those questions. And I look forward to those sorts of questions because that's really important for us to understand how these concepts of God have developed, because it helps us to understand how to understand God. That's my experience. We can take sources, many different sources, because no one source should be accepted as the only source. We should accept as many sources as we can find that are reliable, and by bringing them all together, by seeing them all together, we can understand better for ourselves. And that's really what I'm doing in this course, and that's really what the Institute of All Intelligent Life is about. It's about understanding that all intelligent life throughout the universe is all one family. We all have the same creator, and that creator is really, this is my understanding, according to all these different sources that I've put together so far, that understanding that God really is a monotheistic God. It's not an impersonal force. That is, that the original source of everything, whatever you want to call it, you may not want to call it God, it doesn't matter to me what you call it, but that original source of God, of everything, must be conscious. Otherwise, where has consciousness come from? So the original source of everything, whether you call it God or not, whether you call it or him or she or whatever you want to call it, that original source is a conscious being, a personal means, a conscious being means a person. That's my understanding. So the consciousness of God, of course, is infinite, unlimited, and therefore very, very different than human consciousness or human personality. But that infinite source of everything is an infinite intelligence and an infinite consciousness and an infinite personality. So I'm going to talk about this more in future classes and bring in some more extraterrestrial sources that talk about this. All right, I'm just going to check one more time to see if there are any more questions. Again, another question about artificial intelligence. Having conditions on it through regulators would be good, maybe just like cloning. Yes, we do have to regulate very, very carefully, very intelligently the artificial intelligence. Well, there are no questions about the class. Very interesting. It is a good question. This whole discussion of artificial intelligence is very good, and it's related to the concept of God, because artificial intelligence, some people are sort of seeing it as God. They sort of can think that artificial intelligence will become more and more intelligent, more and more powerful, and it'll become like a God, but that's a false God. Very, very dangerous false God. Okay, I hope that we do get some questions about this class. Otherwise, I'm going to continue discussing other extraterrestrial sources about concepts of spirituality, concepts of divinity. Thank you all very, very much, and we will be meeting again in 3 days, on Thursday evening in California, 7 p.m. California time, and Friday morning at 7 a.m. in Pakistan time. Thank you all very much. Peace be with you.